October the 28th, 1962. 9 o'clock in the morning, Washington time. The Oval Office. A man sits alone near the window, listening to a radio broadcast from Moscow. He is 45 years old, but this morning he looks 60. He has slept perhaps 4 hours in the last 3 days. Under his tailored suit, he wears a steel back brace, because without it, he cannot stand upright. His hands, when he is sure no one is watching, will not stop moving. For 13 days, this man has carried something no human being has ever carried before: the decision of whether 100 million people live or die. The voice on the radio announces that the Soviet Union will dismantle its missiles in Cuba and ship them home. It is over. The world will not burn today. His name is John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and 18 months earlier, almost every powerful man in Washington believed he was a coward. After the Bay of Pigs disaster, in April of 1961, his own generals mocked him behind closed doors. Nikita Khrushchev met him in Vienna that June, bullied him for 2 days, and walked away, telling his aides the American president was weak, inexperienced, a boy who could be pushed. Kennedy himself told a reporter afterward that Khrushchev had savaged him. The most senior officer in the United States Air Force would soon compare him to his face to the men who handed Europe to Hitler. Here is what almost nobody understood at the time. During those 13 days in October, the information that terrified John Kennedy most did not come from Moscow. It came from his own briefing room, from men wearing American uniforms, men who were certain, men who were demanding, men who, we now know, were wrong in a way that would have ended civilization. What exactly was Kennedy told in that room? Why did it terrify him more than the missiles themselves? And how did the man everyone called weak become the only man in Washington strong enough to say no? Hold on to one number as we begin. 162. It will come back, and when it does, you will understand how close we all came. To understand October, you have to understand the 18 months that built it. In April of 1961, the CIA and the military assured the new president that 1,400 Cuban exiles could land at the Bay of Pigs and topple Fidel Castro. They told him the plan was sound. They told him the Cuban people would rise up. Within 72 hours, 114 of those exiles were dead, and almost 1,200 were in Castro's prisons. The plan had been a fantasy from the first page. The men who built it quietly let the blame settle on the 43-year-old president who had trusted them. Kennedy learned the lesson in public humiliation. He later told his advisors he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. But the deeper wound was this: he now knew that the most confident men in any room could be catastrophically wrong, and that their mistakes would be paid for by other people. 2 months later, Vienna. Khrushchev measured the bruised young president across the table and decided he had found a man he could break. Over the following year, the Soviet leader made the most reckless gamble of the Cold War. He began secretly shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. Medium-range ballistic missiles that could reach Washington in 13 minutes. 42,000 Soviet troops to guard them, though American intelligence would estimate only 10,000. By October, the build-up was the largest Soviet military operation ever conducted outside its own borders. On October the 14th, an American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Major Richard Heiser, crossed western Cuba at 72,000 feet and took 928 photographs in 6 minutes. Analysts worked through the night. What they found made experienced men go quiet. At 8:45 on the morning of October the 16th, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy walked into the president's bedroom while Kennedy was still in his pajamas, reading the newspapers. Bundy said there was now hard photographic evidence of Soviet missile bases in Cuba. Kennedy's first decision came within hours, and it tells you everything about what the Bay of Pigs had taught him. He did not summon only the generals. He assembled a small group of advisors that would become known as ExComm, and he did something none of them knew about. He secretly switched on a hidden taping system in the cabinet room. Every word spoken over the next 13 days would be recorded, which means we do not have to guess what Kennedy was told. We can listen to it. And what those tapes captured is the part of this story most Americans have never truly heard, because the first battle of the Cuban Missile Crisis was not fought against the Soviets. It was fought inside the White House between the President of the United States and his own Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the chiefs intended to win it. From the first meeting, the military position was unanimous and absolute. A massive surprise airstrike against the missile sites, the airfields, the storage areas, hundreds of sorties, followed by a full invasion of Cuba. No warning, no negotiation. Speed was everything, they said, because once the missiles became operational, every American city inside their arc would be hostage. On October the 19th, Kennedy met the Joint Chiefs face-to-face in the cabinet room. The tape was running. General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the man who had firebombed Tokyo, leaned into the President of the United States and said that a blockade and political talk would lead right into war. Then he said the words that have stunned historians ever since. He told Kennedy that this course was almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich. Freeze this moment. Look at what is happening in that room. A general has just compared his own commander-in-chief to Neville Chamberlain, to the surrender that fed the world to Hitler. Kennedy's father had been tied to Munich as ambassador to Britain. LeMay knew it. The insult was aimed, personal, and deliberate. LeMay pressed further. He told the president flatly, "You are in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President." Kennedy asked him to repeat it. Then he answered in a flat voice, "You are in there with me." The president walked out of the room. The tape kept running, and the chiefs did not know it. Marine Commandant David Shoup turned to LeMay and praised him for hammering the president, complaining that anything less than total military action was playing around. They spoke about their commander-in-chief, the way men speak about an obstacle. That night, Kennedy told an aide what disturbed him most about the generals. As he put it, "If we listen to them and do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive later to tell them they were wrong." Now, ask the question the title promises. What was Kennedy actually told in those briefings that terrified him? He was told the airstrikes could not guarantee destroying every missile. 90% perhaps, which meant a handful of surviving Soviet missiles, each carrying a warhead with 60 times the power of Hiroshima, aimed at American cities, controlled by officers who had just watched their comrades die under American bombs. He was told the invasion plan projected over 18,000 American casualties in the first 10 days. He was told the Pentagon's own nuclear war planning estimated that a full exchange with the Soviet Union would kill somewhere between 80 and 100 million Americans in the opening hours. Not soldiers, everyone. He privately told his speechwriter Ted Sorensen that he put the odds of war at somewhere between 1 out of 3 and even. 1 out of 3 and even. That was the coin the most powerful man on earth was being asked to flip. But there was one thing nobody in that room had accounted for, and that one thing, hidden on the island of Cuba, changed everything. We will get there. People talk about the weight of command as if it were a metaphor. For Kennedy, in October of 1962, it was not a metaphor. It was a measurable, physical load on a body that was already failing. The public saw a tanned, vigorous young president. The truth was locked in his medical files. Kennedy had Addison's disease, a failure of the adrenal glands that without daily medication would kill him. His spine was so damaged that he had received the last rites of the Catholic Church multiple times after surgeries. During the crisis, he wore his steel brace, took injections for pain, and could not sit through long meetings without agony. This was the body that now had to absorb 13 days of the most sustained pressure any American president has ever faced. On October the 22nd at 7 in the evening, Kennedy went on television and told the world. 100 million Americans watched, the largest audience for a presidential address in history to that point. He announced a naval quarantine of Cuba. Across the country that night, families filled bathtubs with water. Supermarkets in some cities sold out of canned food within hours. School children practiced crawling under their desks as if a desk would matter. On October the 24th, the Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2, the only time in American history, one step below nuclear war. Nearly 3,000 nuclear weapons came to alert status. B-52 bombers loaded with hydrogen bombs flew continuous orbits towards Soviet airspace, one landing as another took off around the clock. General Thomas Power, commander of SAC, broadcast the alert order uncoded in the clear so that Soviet listeners would hear exactly what was pointed at them. He did not ask the president's permission. That same morning, Soviet ships approached the quarantine line with American warships waiting. In the cabinet room, Robert Kennedy watched his brother's hand rise to cover his mouth, watched his fist open and close, and wrote later that for those few seconds it was almost as if no one else was in the room, and that he felt they were on the edge of a precipice with no way off. Then word came that the Soviet ships had stopped dead in the water. Secretary of State Dean Rusk said quietly, "We are eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. The room exhaled. The crisis did not, because the missiles were still in Cuba and Soviet crews were working on them day and night. Every morning, the photographs showed more progress. Every morning, the chiefs returned with the same demand, and each time the window for striking grew shorter and their voices grew harder. Kennedy was now sleeping in fragments. He asked his wife Jacqueline to be ready to move with the children closer to the White House shelter. She refused to leave his side. He told her, according to her later account, that if it came, they would face it together on the lawn. In the quiet hours, Kennedy did something almost no one knew. He had been reading Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, about how Europe's leaders stumbled into World War I through pride, miscalculation, and momentum. He kept returning to one story from it, about two German statesmen after the war. One asked how it all happened. The other answered, if only one knew. Kennedy told his brother that if anyone survived this, he refused to let them write a book called The Missiles of October that ended the same way. That sentence was the entire crisis in miniature. Every force around him, Soviet and American, was generating momentum toward war. He was one man with a broken back and failing glands, trying to be the friction. He did not know it yet, but the worst day of his life, and very nearly the last day of the modern world, was less than 72 hours away. They would come to call it Black Saturday, October the 27th, 1962. It began with hope. The night before, Khrushchev had sent a long, rambling, deeply personal letter. He wrote of war as a knot that the two leaders were pulling tighter, warning that if they pulled hard enough, the knot would have to be cut with the sword of nuclear war. He offered a way out: remove the missiles in exchange for a pledge not to invade Cuba. For a few hours, the men in the White House believed it was ending. Then Saturday morning, a second letter arrived, harder, colder, broadcast publicly. New demand: American missiles out of Turkey too. The chiefs declared it proof that talking was finished. At roughly noon, an American U-2 strayed off course over Soviet Siberia. Soviet fighters scrambled to shoot it down. American fighters scrambled to protect it, and because of the DEFCON alert, those American fighters were armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles. Kennedy, hearing it, gave a short, bitter laugh and said there is always some son of a bitch who does not get the word. Then, early afternoon, the news that stopped the room: a surface-to-air missile battery in Cuba had fired on a U-2 over the island. Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., 35 years old, a father of 3 from South Carolina, was dead in the wreckage. The first and only combat death of the crisis. Standing orders, drawn up earlier by XCOM itself, called for an immediate retaliatory strike on the missile site that fired. The Joint Chiefs no longer requested, they demanded. The full airstrike, they said, no later than Monday morning, followed by invasion. The machinery Kennedy had feared was sliding into gear on its own. McNamara walked out of the meetings into the autumn evening that night and wondered, by his own later account, whether he would live to see another Saturday. Kennedy held the strike order in his hands, and he did not sign it. He said quietly that it was not the missile site he was at war with, and ordered one last channel opened. That night, he sent his brother Robert, exhausted and grey-faced, to meet the Soviet ambassador in secret, carrying an offer and a warning. Time, Robert told him, was running out. Events were outrunning the men who started them. Then there was nothing left to do. The President of the United States went back to the White House and waited in the dark to learn whether the world would still exist on Monday. He did not know about the cable traffic in Moscow. He did not know what was hidden in the Cuban jungle, the thing behind the number 162. He did not know that beneath the Caribbean, on a Soviet submarine, cut off from all contact, 3 exhausted officers were at that very hour arguing over whether to fire a nuclear torpedo at the American ships above them. He only knew that the generals would be back in the morning, and that he was running out of ways to say no. Washington, the night of October the 27th. The lights in the West Wing stayed on, but the building had gone quiet. The President of the United States sat with his brother, and according to Robert Kennedy's own account, the talk drifted strangely to Abraham Lincoln. The President said this was the night he should go to the theater. Robert answered that if he was going, he wanted to go with him. Gallows humor, because both men believed there was a real chance the bombs would fly within 48 hours. Here is what neither of them knew. The decision that came closest to ending the world that day had already been made. Not in Washington, not in Moscow. 400 feet beneath the Caribbean, inside a steel tube full of dying air. The Soviet submarine B-59 had been running submerged for days, cut off from Moscow, hunted by American destroyers. The Americans were dropping practice depth charges, small signaling explosives meant to force her to surface. The Soviet crew did not know they were signals. To the men inside, it sounded like the war had started. The air conditioning had failed in tropical water. The temperature inside the boat passed 120 degrees. Carbon dioxide climbed toward poisonous levels. Sailors were fainting at their posts, one after another. And B-59 carried something American intelligence did not know existed: a torpedo with a nuclear warhead. Captain Valentin Savitsky, exhausted, half suffocated, convinced his country was already under attack, ordered the nuclear torpedo readied. According to the account of intelligence officer Vadim Orlov, who was aboard, Savitsky shouted that they would die down there, but they would sink them all, rather than disgrace the fleet. Soviet procedure required the captain and the political officer to agree. Both said fire, but by pure chance, one more man was aboard that particular boat: Vasily Arkhipov, chief of staff of the whole flotilla, which meant his consent was required too. 3 votes needed. 2 said yes. Arkhipov, calm in a boat full of men at the edge of breakdown, said no. He argued Savitsky down. Surface. Signal. Wait. The torpedo stayed in its tube, and B-59 rose into the searchlights of the American Navy, and the night did not end in fire. The President of the United States went to sleep that night, not knowing that a single Soviet officer's stubbornness had just saved his country. He would never learn Arkhipov's name. Almost no one would for 40 years. While the submarine drama played out unseen, Kennedy made his own last moves. At about 7:45 that evening, Robert Kennedy sat across from Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin at the Justice Department. Dobrynin's cable to Moscow, declassified decades later, describes the Attorney General as a man at the end of his strength, admitting he had barely seen his children in days. Robert delivered 2 things: a promise, the American missiles in Turkey would be gone within months, but the deal would die the instant it became public, and a warning. The American military was demanding action, events were spinning loose, and an answer was needed in hours, not days, and Kennedy kept one final card hidden, even from most of his own advisors. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, on the president's instruction, quietly arranged for a contact at the United Nations to be ready, on a signal, to have the UN Secretary General publicly propose the Turkey trade himself. If everything else failed, Kennedy was prepared to accept it in the open and absorb the political destruction. He would let them call him weak forever before he let the missiles fly. That arrangement stayed secret for 25 years. Was Kennedy weak? Every general in his briefing room thought so. They were looking at the wrong kind of strength. In Moscow, the morning of October the 28th, Nikita Khrushchev gathered his ministers at a dacha outside the city and told them, by the account of those present, that they were face to face with the danger of war and nuclear catastrophe, with the possible result of destroying the human race. Then a report arrived that hardened everything. A letter from Fidel Castro, written in a bunker during the bombardment scare, urging Khrushchev that if the Americans invaded, the Soviet Union should strike first with nuclear weapons. Khrushchev read it and was horrified. He later wrote that only a man who had no idea what nuclear war meant could propose such a thing. The Soviet leader chose. The answer went out uncoded, by open radio, because there was no time for encryption. At 9 in the morning, Washington time, Radio Moscow announced the missiles would be dismantled, cratered, and returned to the Soviet Union. Which brings us back to that man by the window in the Oval Office. Now, you know part of what he survived to reach that chair. You do not yet know the worst of it. Neither did he, because the full truth of October 1962 stayed buried for 30 years, and when it finally surfaced, it made the toughest man in Kennedy's cabinet go pale in public. In 1992, American, Soviet, and Cuban veterans of the crisis met at a conference in Havana. Robert McNamara, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, the man who had managed the crisis hour by hour, sat in that room. Across from him sat General Anatoly Gribkov, who in 1962 had helped plan the entire Soviet deployment, and Gribkov began to talk. The Americans had believed there were about 10,000 Soviet troops on Cuba. The real number was over 42,000, dug in, equipped, ready. Then the number this whole story has been waiting for. American intelligence had tracked the big strategic missiles, the ones aimed at American cities. What it never found was the rest. By the time the crisis peaked, the Soviet Union had approximately 162 nuclear warheads on the island of Cuba, and dozens of them were tactical weapons, short-range lunar rockets, nuclear-armed cruise missiles positioned to vaporize an invasion fleet, with one battery sited within reach of the American base at Guantanamo. Weapons designed for exactly one scenario. The scenario the Joint Chiefs had demanded, in writing, every single day for 13 days. Now replay the tape of October. The airstrike the generals promised would solve everything could not have destroyed weapons nobody knew existed. The invasion set for the following week would have sent American troops onto beaches covered by nuclear fire. Soviet commanders on the island had the warheads at hand. Communications with Moscow were slow and breakable, and the men holding them believed they were about to be overrun. McNamara heard all of it and did the arithmetic out loud. No one, he said, should imagine that American forces could be struck with tactical nuclear weapons without America answering in kind. And where would it have ended, he asked, in utter disaster. So look again at the 13 days. Every advisor who told Kennedy that bombing was safe was wrong. Every general who told him invasion was manageable was wrong. The men who called him soft were marching him with total confidence toward the deaths of 100 million people. The only thing standing between their certainty and that outcome was a president who had been burned once at the Bay of Pigs and had sworn never again to mistake confidence for truth. The thing that terrified Kennedy in those briefings was not the enemy's missiles. It was the realization that the most dangerous force in the room was certainty itself. He was right. He was more right than he would ever live to know. And here is where it gets strange. On the morning the crisis ended, the men who had been wrong did not believe they had been wrong at all. October the 28th. Within hours of the Radio Moscow broadcast, Kennedy met the Joint Chiefs to thank them for their support. Curtis LeMay did not accept the thanks. By the accounts of men in that room, the Air Force chief pounded the table and called the peaceful resolution the greatest defeat in American history and demanded the invasion go forward anyway. Kennedy stared at him, and witnesses said the president was simply stunned. The missiles were leaving, the war was cancelled, and the general wanted his invasion regardless. Kennedy let it pass. He had learned to let the table pounding pass. Privately, he gave strict orders that there would be no gloating, no victory speeches, no humiliation of Khrushchev. He told his staff that every leader must be left a door to walk through, because a cornered nuclear power is the most dangerous thing on Earth. The Turkey deal stayed secret. Kennedy absorbed years of criticism for trading nothing, when in fact he had quietly traded something precisely so that peace would hold. Freeze this final image of the crisis. Two leaders, each savaged by his own hardliners, each protecting the other's retreat. Khrushchev, in his memoirs, gave the verdict that mattered most, the verdict of the enemy. He wrote that Kennedy had shown sober-mindedness, real wisdom, and statesmanship, and that he had not let his country be frightened into catastrophe. The man who had walked out of Vienna calling Kennedy a weak boy, now wrote of him with open respect. It was the same man. It was never the same man again. 18 months separated the Bay of Pigs from the missile crisis. The newspapers had called him naive. Khrushchev had called him soft. His own generals had compared him to the appeasers of Munich, to his face, on tape. Now 74% of Americans approved of his presidency. Yet the redemption Kennedy wanted was not a poll number. On June the 10th, 1963, he stood before the graduating class at American University and gave the speech he had been writing in his head since Black Saturday. He asked Americans to re-examine their view of the Soviet people, and he closed with words that came straight out of those 13 days. In the final analysis, he said, "We all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." Moscow let the speech be broadcast uncensored, the first American address ever carried whole to the Soviet public. 8 weeks later, the two nations signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, the first nuclear arms agreement in history, ending the test explosions that had been poisoning the atmosphere of the entire planet. A direct hotline was wired between Washington and Moscow, so that no future crisis would ever again depend on a letter crawling through embassy channels while bombers circled. Kennedy signed the treaty in October 1963 and called it a shaft of light cut into the darkness. He considered it the proudest achievement of his life. Now return one last time to the morning of October the 28th. The man by the window, 45 years old and looking 60, the steel brace under his suit, 4 hours of sleep, listening to Moscow stand down. You watched that scene at the start of this story and saw a president who got lucky. Look again. You are looking at a man who spent 13 days as the only barrier between two armed machines that both wanted to move, who took the insults, hid the deal, paid the political price in silence, and held the line with a broken body and a number in his head. 1 out of 3, and even. He flipped nothing. He simply refused, hour after hour, to let anyone else flip it. Before we finish, one thing. If someone in your family served during the Cold War, Strategic Air Command, the Navy on that quarantine line, a missile crew sitting alert in a silo in October 1962, put their name in the comments, their unit, where they stood that week. Most of them never told their families how close it came. These stories are disappearing faster than we realize. Do not let that happen. The final accounting reads like this: 13 days, 1 combat death. Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., whose widow received the very first Air Force Cross ever awarded. Approximately 162 Soviet warheads quietly shipped home from Cuba, dozens of which Washington never knew were there. 15 Jupiter missiles gone from Turkey by April 1963. 1 treaty, 1 hotline, 0 cities burned. Vasily Arkhipov went home to a navy that treated his patrol as an embarrassment. He served quietly, retired a vice admiral, and died in 1998 before the world learned what he had done in that suffocating submarine. In 2002, when the story finally broke, the director of America's National Security Archive put it in one sentence: a guy named Arkhipov saved the world. John Kennedy had 13 months left. He spent them building the treaty, the hotline, the opening to Moscow, the architecture that would keep the Cold War cold for 30 more years. After the Bay of Pigs, he had told a friend that the first advice he would give his successor was to watch the generals and never to assume that because they were military men, their opinions on military matters were worth a damn. In October 1962, he took his own advice alone, against the unanimous fury of every uniform in the room. The men who demanded the invasion lived long lives. The 100 million people their plan would have killed never learned how close they came. He knew. That was the weight he carried out of that room. And he carried it quietly, all the way to Dallas.